The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when Elliot got home from work. Not a birthday card, not a bill, just a plain white envelope with his name written in his father's handwriting. That careful, old-fashioned cursive that Vernon Marsh had used his entire life. The kind that belonged on a check or a legal document, never on something casual. Elliot stood there in his coat, still holding his keys, and stared at it for a long moment before he picked it up. Inside was a single folded note and 3 $50 bills. Come to the house Saturday morning. Bring nothing. Dad, that was it. No explanation, no phone call to follow. Elliot tried calling his father that evening and got the voicemail. He tried again the next morning. Same thing. Sore. His brother Knox called him Thursday night, confused and a little annoyed, asking if Elliot had any idea what their father was up to. Elliot said he didn't. Their youngest brother, Seth, sent a text that just read, "Weird, right?" Vernon Marsh was 71 years old, and he had built everything from nothing. That was the family story, the one told at every Christmas dinner and every summer barbecue at the house on the lake outside of Kelowna. He had arrived in British Columbia from a small town in Manitoba with $400, used pickup truck, and no connections. He had started in logging, moved into land development, and eventually built a real estate portfolio that stretched from the Okanagan all the way to the lower mainland. He was not the kind of man who sent cryptic envelopes. He was the kind of man who called meetings. So on Saturday morning, all 3 of his sons drove to the house. Elliot was 39. He had been working for his father's company for 12 years, managing the residential development side of things, which meant he spent most of his days in meetings and on phone calls and reviewing contracts. He drove a good car. He lived in a nice house in West Kelowna that his father had helped him purchase. He had a daughter who was 7 and a wife, Christine, who had once mentioned, quietly and without accusation, that she sometimes felt like Elliot worked for his father's life more than he worked for their own. He hadn't forgotten that. He just hadn't known what to do with it. Knox was 43 and ran the commercial side of Marsh Properties. He was the oldest, and he had always operated like he knew it. He was efficient and confident, and a little sharp at the edges. He had his father's patience for numbers, but not always his patience for people. His marriage had ended 2 years ago, and he had moved into a downtown condo and started working longer hours, which was the Marsh family way of dealing with things that hurt. Seth was 34. He was the one who had left. Not dramatically. Seth hadn't stormed out or had some big falling out with their father. He had just quietly decided not to join the company. He had gone to school for environmental science, done a few years with a conservation nonprofit up north, and then come back to the valley and started a small landscaping business that focused on native plant restoration. He drove an old truck. He rented a place in Summerland with a big yard. He seemed, to Elliot at least, genuinely content in a way that was almost hard to understand. Their father had never said anything outright negative about Seth's choices. But there had been a silence around those choices that said plenty. Vernon was waiting for them in the kitchen when they arrived. He had made coffee. He looked well. He always looked well. That particular kind of well that came from decades of early mornings and hard work and not drinking too much and never quite sitting still. He poured 3 mugs and set them on the table and then sat down himself, and he looked at his sons with an expression that Elliot couldn't immediately read. "I'm going to ask you to do something," Vernon said, "and I'm going to need you to agree before I explain it." Knox set down his mug. "That's not how agreements work, Dad. I know. Agree anyway." There was a silence. Seth was looking out the window at the lake. Elliot was watching his father's face. "Okay," Elliot said. Knox exhaled slowly. "Fine." Seth turned back from the window. "Sure." Vernon reached into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt and set 3 envelopes on the table. Same plain white. Same careful handwriting. "Each of you has $100 in there," he said. "I want you to take it, go somewhere, doesn't matter where, as long as it's not here, and spend 2 weeks living on it. No credit cards, no tapping into savings, no calling anyone in this family for money or a place to stay." He paused. "You have until the 14th. Come back here for dinner that night. Tell me what happened." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when three adults are trying to decide, simultaneously, whether someone is joking. "You're not joking," Knox said. "I am not joking, Dad." Knox's voice had gone careful and measured, the way it got when he was trying not to say something too directly. "I have a company to run. Your company. I have site meetings next week and a closing on the Glenmore project." "The company will manage," Vernon said. "It did before you were there." "That's a little." "It did," Vernon said simply. "It will again for 2 weeks." Elliot looked down at the envelope in his hands. $100. He was trying to do the math and found that he couldn't quite get there, not because the arithmetic was complicated, but because his brain kept sliding off the number like it wasn't real. When had $100 last meant anything to him? He bought coffee without thinking about it. He bought rounds for people without thinking about it. He had a standing grocery order that his wife managed, and he never looked at the total. "What's this for?" Seth asked. He was the only one who didn't sound defensive. He sounded genuinely curious. Vernon looked at him for a moment before answering. "I've been watching the three of you," he said, "and I've been thinking about what I built and what I actually gave you, and I want to know something." He picked up his coffee. "I want to know who you are when there's no name behind you." Nobody said anything. "The Marsh name opens doors," Vernon said. "I know that. I built it that way. But I want to know what you do when the door doesn't open. When nobody knows your father. When you have to figure it out the way I had to figure it out." He set the mug down. "Go find that out. Then come back." Elliot drove home in a kind of fog. He sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. Christine was at the kitchen table doing something on her laptop, and their daughter, Maya, was watching something in the living room with the volume low. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. It felt suddenly like a photograph of a life he was standing outside of. He told Christine that evening, after Maya was in bed. He told her all of it. The envelope, the $100, the 2 weeks, the explanation that hadn't quite felt like an explanation. She listened without interrupting, which was something she was good at. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to do it?" she said. "I told him I would." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." She nodded slowly. Something moved across her face that he couldn't entirely read. Not quite worry, not quite relief, something in between. "Okay," she said. "Then go." Knox left for Vancouver. This made a certain kind of sense. Knox was a city person. He knew people in Vancouver. But then again, he couldn't call them for money or a place to stay. That was the rule. So he drove out to the coast and checked into the cheapest motel he could find, somewhere off the highway in Burnaby, and spent the first 3 days trying to treat the whole thing like a project. He made lists. He calculated how much he could spend per day if he needed to eat for 14 days. He looked for short-term cash work on community boards and found a landscaping crew that needed a body for a few days, which he got, though he had never done physical labor in any sustained way and found it harder than he expected. He pulled muscles he hadn't used. He got a blister across his palm that made him feel, privately, embarrassed by his own softness. What Knox didn't account for, what his lists couldn't prepare him for, was the silence. In his regular life, Knox was always reachable. There was always something incoming. A text, an email, a call. The company was a constant ambient hum that he moved through without noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of a refrigerator in a room. Out here, in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning product, with a burn phone he'd bought at a drugstore, the silence was almost physical. He lay awake the third night and thought about his marriage. He had never in 2 years let himself do that properly. There had been things to attend to, always. The division of assets, the new condo, the work especially. He thought about Nadine and the way she used to make tea in the morning, and the particular sound of her laugh when something genuinely surprised her, and the fact that he hadn't made her laugh in the last 2 years of their marriage because he had been too busy being capable and correct. He didn't cry. Knox Marsh did not cry, or at least he told himself that. But he lay there for a long time in the dark and breathed and felt something loosen, slightly, in his chest. He didn't call anyone. He ate cheap. He worked the physical jobs. He kept his lists. But something was different about him by the end of the first week. And he knew it, even if he couldn't have named it yet. Seth didn't go anywhere dramatic. He drove back to Summerland, to his rented place on the half-acre with the garden he'd been slowly converting for the past 3 years. He hadn't touched his savings, and he hadn't called anyone for help. He had the $100 from his father, plus the $47 already in his wallet. He worked his regular jobs, the restoration contract with the regional district, the private client who wanted native grasses in a slope garden. But he didn't charge to the business account. He paid for everything cash. He ate from his own garden mostly, which was easier than he expected at this time of year. He traded some early kale from a cold frame with his neighbor for a dozen eggs. He borrowed a book from the Summerland library because he was out of reading material and couldn't justify the purchase. By the end of the first week, he had spent $63. On day 9, he called his father from a payphone. He had kept the one number he was allowed, and he didn't think a payphone technically violated the rules, though he wasn't entirely sure, and left a message that said, "Dad, I think I might be the only one who's been missing the point. See you on the 14th. He wasn't sure what he meant by it when he said it. He spent the rest of the week thinking it through. What he kept coming back to was a conversation he'd had years ago with a Sioux elder he'd worked with on a land project in the North Okanagan. The man had said something about wealth that Seth had written down and then half forgotten. The question isn't what you have. The question is what you can do without and still feel whole. Seth had thought at the time that this was about the land, about ecosystems learning to recover without intervention. Now he thought maybe it was also about people. He thought about his father, about what his father must have felt, arriving in a new province with $400 and no one who knew his name. Not ashamed of the smallness of it, not waiting for the smallness to end, just present in it, working inside of it, building upward from the ground. He thought about his brothers and wondered how they were doing and hoped they were okay. Elliot took the ferry to Victoria. He wasn't sure why. It was impulsive, which was unusual for him. He had stood in his driveway with his bag and the $100 in his pocket and thought, somewhere I don't know anyone. Somewhere the Marsh name means nothing. And Victoria had felt, for some reason, like the right answer. He found a hostel in a shared room, $12 a night, which he had never done in his adult life. He was in a room with 5 other people, a backpacker from Ontario, 2 university students doing some kind of field program, a retired man from Quebec who read paperbacks all day and smiled at everyone without much conversation. Elliot lay on his bunk the first night and stared at the ceiling and felt something he could only describe as naked. Not uncomfortable exactly, just stripped. The first few days were strange. He walked a lot, which he hadn't done in years. Not walking for exercise or between meetings, but walking with nowhere to go. He found himself in neighborhoods he'd never have reason to be in otherwise. He ate breakfast at a diner on Cook Street, where the coffee was terrible and the staff clearly knew all the regulars by name and order. He started going back every morning. By day 4, the woman behind the counter, Phoebe, mid-50s, efficient and funny in a dry way, called him the eggs because he always ordered the same thing. "Where are you from?" she asked him once when it was quiet. "Kelowna," he said. Sort of. I grew up there. I work there. But lately I'm not sure it's..." He stopped. "Never mind." She refilled his coffee without asking. "You running from something or toward something?" "I actually don't know," he said. She seemed to find this acceptable. On day 6, he walked into a local print shop on Johnson Street because he'd seen a sign in the window asking for part-time help. He had never worked in a print shop. He had no relevant experience. But he went in and talked to the owner, a younger guy named Otto who was clearly skeptical, and Elliot said, "Look, I'll work 2 days for free. If you think I'm useful, pay me whatever's fair for the rest of the week. If not, no loss to you." Otto had looked at him for a long moment. "What do you actually do for work?" "Real estate development." "And you want to work in a print shop?" "For this week, yeah." Otto hired him. The pay was $13 an hour, which was more than Elliot expected. He spent 3 days cutting, collating, loading paper, learning the quirks of a large format printer. His hands remembered how to be useful in a physical way. He'd done construction work one summer in university, and there was something similar in the muscle memory of it. He came back at the end of the 3rd day, with color on his forearms from a leak in an ink cartridge, and feeling, quietly, more like himself than he had, in longer than he could remember. He called Christine on the borrowed hostel phone because his cell had died, and he'd decided not to buy a charger. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "How are you?" she said. "Good," he said. "Actually good. Not you know how I usually say good." "Yeah," she said. "I know how you usually say it." He asked about Maya. Christine told him she had lost her 2nd tooth and had strong opinions about the tooth fairy's going rate, and had apparently been researching this using the school library computer. He laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere low in his chest. "I've been thinking," he said. "Tell me." "Not on the phone, when I get back." A pause. "Okay," she said. "I'll be here." He lay awake that night thinking about the question his father had asked, not the official question, the one about living on $100, but the real one underneath it. Who are you when there's no name behind you? Elliot Marsh. 42 floors of glass and steel and signed contracts and people who called him back because of who his father was. Elliot, 39. The eggs. A man who talked to a diner waitress about not knowing which direction he was going. A man who cleaned ink off the inside of a printer and felt something close to satisfaction. A man lying in a hostel bunk listening to a retired teacher from Rimouski quietly turn the pages of a paperback in the next bed. He thought, I'm not sure those are different people, but I think I've only been letting one of them breathe. The 14th came gray and cold, which was typical for that time of year in the Okanagan. Elliot drove back in the morning, taking the connector through the mountains, the way he'd driven it hundreds of times. But something about it felt different. Not the road, but the way he was sitting in it, less automatic. Knox arrived at the house before him. He was standing in the kitchen when Elliot walked in, and there was something subtly different about his older brother that Elliot noticed before he could identify it. He looked tired. He also looked like he'd been somewhere. Seth arrived last, coming up from Summerland, with a bag of something from his garden that he set on the counter. Garlic, a few late carrots, some dried herbs in brown paper. Their father made dinner. This was unusual. Vernon Marsh ate dinner out most nights or reheated things. But he cooked that evening. A simple roast, vegetables, bread from a bakery in town. He didn't ask them anything until they were all sitting down. Then he said, "Tell me." Knox went first. He talked for a long time, which was also unusual. Knox was normally precise and brief, but he talked about the motel in Burnaby and the landscaping work and the blister on his palm and the silence. He talked about lying awake at night. He didn't say Nadine's name, but he talked about the way you can spend years moving fast enough that you never have to feel the weight of something you've lost. He said, "I made lists the whole time. Tried to manage it like a project, but you can't manage silence. It just sits there." He looked at his hands. "I think I've been managing everything," he said, "and I think that might be what went wrong." Vernon listened without interrupting. Seth talked about the payphone call. He talked about the Silks elder and the thing about feeling whole without things. He talked about bartering kale for eggs with his neighbor and how that transaction had felt more real to him than most of the business he conducted in a given week. He talked about the question that had stayed with him through all 14 days. Did our father arrive in BC poor, or did he arrive there free? Both, Vernon said quietly. It was both, Seth nodded. Yeah, he said. I think I've always understood that, but I think I've been using it as an excuse to stay small. I'm not supposed to stay small, I'm supposed to build something too. Just differently. Elliot talked last. He told them about the ferry, the hostel, Phoebe and the diner, the print shop, the ink on his arms. He talked about the hostel bunk and the man from Rimouski and calling Christine on the borrowed phone. He talked about the question, the real one. I think I've been living my life at one remove, he said. Like I'm the guy who manages things on behalf of the actual Elliot, who's going to show up eventually when there's time. He stopped. There's never going to be time. That's not how it works. He looked at his father. I think you knew that. I think you've been watching us and seeing that we've been comfortable in a way that was costing us something. And you didn't know how to say it directly, so you sent us out with $100. Vernon was quiet for a moment. I tried to say it directly, he said. A few times. You're right that I didn't know how. He paused. I also should have taught you sooner. Not now. Not at your ages. I should have made sure you knew who you were before I made it so easy to not have to find out. He looked at each of them. That's on me. I want to say that clearly. What I gave you was good, but it also let you avoid something important. I knew it. I waited too long to do anything about it. The acknowledgement sat in the room for a moment. What happens now? Knox asked. Nothing dramatic, Vernon said. You keep working. I keep working. But I want to change how we talk about things. He looked at Knox. I want you to take a real week off. Not a project management week. A week with no deliverables. He looked at Seth. I want to sit down with you and hear what you're building. For real, not as the family exception. As a businessman. He looked at Elliot. And I want you to talk to Christine. Whatever you've been thinking about saying to her, say it. Elliot nodded. That's it? Knox said. That's everything, Vernon said. The rest is up to you. 3 weeks later, Elliot and Christine sat at the kitchen table after Maya was in bed. The house was quiet. Elliot had made tea, which he almost never did. He told her what he'd been thinking in the hostel, and in the print shop, and on the drive home through the mountains. He told her about the question his father had asked, and what he thought the real answer was. He told her that he thought he'd been managing his life instead of living it, and that he wasn't sure what the alternative looked like exactly, but that he wanted to figure it out with her, not after he'd sorted it out on his own. Christine wrapped her hands around her mug. I've been waiting for you to say something like that, she said, not with anger. With something more like relief. How long, he said. A while, she said. A few years, maybe. He felt the weight of that, not as an accusation, but as information, as a thing to work with. I'm sorry it took me this long, he said. You're here now, she said. Outside, the valley was dark. The lake would be cold and still, the orchards bare, the hills running brown and gray toward the water. In the spring, the whole thing would come back, the blossoms first, then the green, then the long warm light of a Okanagan summer that always felt, even after all these years, like something given freely. Elliot sat with his wife in the quiet kitchen and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like someone who had arrived somewhere,